Good morning. My name again is Daoud. I'm the Executive Director of the Michigan Chapter of CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations. And CARE, Michigan is a chapter of America's largest civil liberties and advocacy organization for American Muslims. We are based in Washington, D.C., and the organization is going on 22 years old. The Michigan chapter was started in the year 2000, and I have been the executive director for seemingly an eternity, which is about 10 years. I was born in Detroit, but raised in Chesterfield County, Virginia, which is at that time, a semi-rural suburb outside of the city of Richmond, which is the capital of the state of Virginia. It was also the capital of the Confederate States of America, which will inform you, maybe give you a little insight on how I view things as I continue my talk. I also served for 4 years in the United States Navy from 1994 to 1998 before coming back to Michigan and going back to college. Today's discussion, I will be giving like a little brief history on Islamophobia and how it plays itself out now. And then I will avail myself for any questions or statements. Just to let you know, and I heard your professor's comments about a speaker you had here previously and how there is some uncomfortability. I'm probably going to say a few things that are going to make some of you uncomfortable. But that's the beauty of being in an academic setting, especially here in the United States of America, that we're able to discuss issues freely, and there is no intellectual growth or stimulation without some tension, without pushing ourselves into new realms. Kind of like I played football for quite a while, including 1 year in undergrad, and the maximum I was able ever to bench press was 350 pounds. I didn't start off that way. I started off like at about 200 and something pounds, and I went through a lot of pain, and there was some muscle tear, and there was like lactic acid buildup and soreness. So we have to, if you're not being challenged intellectually, similarly like it's this muscle here, right? We can't grow into deeper understanding, and that sometimes takes us into a place of discomfort. And so again, I may take you into some places of discomfort. The American Muslim experience is very diverse and is misunderstood by a large segment of the American population. Muslims have been here on this land before there was ever a formal United States of America at the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Muslims have been in this part of the world at least since the first West Africans were enslaved and brought here under chattel slavery. So it's estimated that between 20 and 30% of of West Africans who were brought here were Muslims. And of course this makes sense because there were no Christians in West Africa 500 years ago. Christianity did not exist. Christianity was later spread in West Africa through colonialism. So there were no Christians there. There were people who were practicing two types of faiths or traditions: indigenous religions. Animism is not the proper term, I don't think, but we could say traditional religions from tribes, and Islam, because there were actually Islamic kingdoms like the Malian Empire, the Songhai and the Ghanaian Empire. Some of you may have heard of Mansa Musa, who Forbes magazine listed perhaps the richest person in the history of humankind. He was Muslim. He was the emperor of the Malian Empire. So Muslims being present in America is as old as this country itself, and Muslims were involved in helping build this nation up and to make it an industrial powerhouse and help build the American empire. This is historical reality. It's historical fact. So this is really the first time that Muslims were in America. Now, because of the dichotomy of America, many of these, 99% of these Muslims lost their religion. And how that happened is that when people were enslaved, then children were systematically separated from their parents. There wasn't a way of knowledge to be disseminated, of Islamic knowledge, and then freedom of religion wasn't practiced or allowed to be practiced. The people who were enslaved took on the religious ways and norms of their masters. Just like last names, right? Any African American who has a last name named Williams is because someone named Williams owned their family. And thusly, if someone was owned by a French slave master in Louisiana, the enslaved Africans became Catholic. If their master was in Georgia or Alabama and they were Baptists or a Protestant denomination, they became Protestant. Like, that's just how it happened. The next wave of Muslims coming to America was voluntary, through voluntary immigration. And I use this word voluntary and immigration together just for clarification purposes, because really people who are immigrants to this country, the connotations that people come here or immigrate here voluntarily unless they came here as refugees. So when people say America is a nation of immigrants, this is only half true, because there were already Native Americans or indigenous people living here, one, and then two, African Americans cannot truly be considered immigrants because it was forced. African Americans were, people of African descent, were forced to come here against their will. That doesn't qualify as immigration. So when we say this country is a nation of immigrants, that is a half truth. That's not the reality of America. That's a myth of America. So voluntary immigration, Muslims began to immigrate here voluntarily after the Civil War. In the later part of the 1800s, from a number of places, from part of the Arab world and from Turkey, Albania, those countries that are part of the Ottoman Empire. It's an unknown fact that by many Americans that actually the first country that recognized the sovereignty of the United States of America was Morocco. Morocco is a Muslim country, it's located in North Africa. This was the first country that recognized America's sovereignty from the British at the Declaration of Independence and the start of the Revolutionary War. So Muslims migrated to the United States of America looking for the American dream like other immigrants, looking for the ability to have economic dignity and to own property. That's why people migrated here to these United States of America. What drew a large percentage of Muslims from from the former Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire constitutes what's called the Levant, which is modern-day Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and then also the areas of Turkey and parts of Eastern Europe, and I mentioned Albania. Bosnia was under that as well. Muslims began to immigrate to the Americas and flocked to southeastern Michigan in particular. So like southeastern Michigan is basically the genesis of Muslims or Islam as a socio-political expression in America is in this area. And a big reason for that is Henry Ford. And the automobile industry is probably is the biggest single force. Henry Ford definitely had some race problems, no doubt about it. He has a mixed history, just like America has a mixed history. But Muslims came here from different countries, the so-called Middle East, for the same reason that African Americans came to this area in the earlier part of the 20th century for economic opportunities. And Henry Ford was the first industrialist to offer a person of color on the assembly line the same hourly wage as a white man. So like this was like historic. In other corporations, other places, if a Chinese man worked in a plant somewhere in New York or in California, he wasn't getting the same wage as a white man. Like that wasn't happening. If an African American or a Mexican American worked in a plant somewhere in New York or in Chicago, working with textiles or whatever, they were not getting the same hourly wage as a white man. Henry Ford was the first person to do this, so I mean it was a good wage at the time. So people began to flock here. And when they flocked here, then later on, they told their extended family members, and they then began to migrate to Michigan for these good-paying jobs at that time. So this is the first wave of voluntary immigration of Muslims to the United States of America. Then there was a block. And this is the first real time we can see Islamophobia in the political discourse in the United States of America. And let me define this term, Islamophobia. Islamophobia, before I continue, I mean we have the term fear. So some people say Islamophobia is an irrational fear of anything relating to Muslims or Islam. That's too complicated. Islamophobia just basically means anti-Muslim racism. That's it. Islamophobia means anti-Muslim racism. And Islam is a faith, but Islam has been racialized in America. It's a racialized faith. Religion has always been racialized in America. There's a book written about this called How the Irish Became White. When Irish people began to voluntarily migrate to America, Catholicism was considered a non-white religion. Irish people had their own box. They had the white box and there was an Irish box. So Irish people were socially non-white in America 100 years ago. Italian people were not socially white at one time. European Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, were not considered socially white. 100 years ago, there was no discourse about America being a Judeo-Christian religion. No. Jewish people were not considered real white folks. You know, if you look at who the Ku Klux Klan targeted after black people, it was Jewish Americans. You see, eventually these groups end up getting their white card. Islam and Muslims in general is still considered socially a non-white religion, even for people who have migrated from Europe. The majority of Muslims in America have always been people of African descent. You know, so so Islam has been racialized. So going back to Islamophobia, the first time we see Islamophobia in a real social-political discourse is at World War I, where our country was a part of what is called the Allied powers against the so-called Axis powers. Germany, Japan, and also part of that was the Ottoman Empire, which was controlled and governed by Muslims, by Turks, by Turkish people. So then people in Congress start talking about the Turkish problem. Turk was just a term used for anyone who was Muslim, including Arab. So what happened was, around the time of World War I, there was a notorious Immigration Act of 1924. It's also called the Asian Exclusion Act, that basically barred or basically barred or severely restricted people who could immigrate to the United States of America from the non-European Axis powers, which includes those Muslim countries, as a way of stopping the Turkish problem. Okay, so Muslims, in effect, were thwarted from immigrating to the United States of America for almost 40 years. And then this was lifted in the year 1965 with the Immigration Act of 1965, which came about due to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. 1965 is actually the last time our country has had comprehensive immigration reform. It's been 50 years since we had real immigration reform in the United States of America, which is shameful. So with the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Immigration Act of 1965, Muslims began to immigrate again to these United States of America from primarily starting as being students, and then those who were getting work visas from very skilled professions like engineers, scientists, and people in the medical profession. Which then accounts for another reason why there are so many Muslims in metropolitan Detroit area now, is because metropolitan Detroit, any metropolitan area, has the highest percentage per capita of engineers of any major city, of any metropolitan area in America, due to the automobile industry. And a large percentage of these engineers are people who come from the countries of India, Pakistan, and also Arab countries. So this is another reason why there are so many Muslims who reside in this area. It again relates to the automobile industry. So Islamophobia, or this anti-Muslim racism, then comes across mainstream media in a big way and on TV, also close to the same time period. And this relates to also the city of Detroit. Because if we go back in time a little bit to 1930, the proto-Islamic movement called the Nation of Islam was started in the city of Detroit. It was started in Detroit by a man by the name of Farad Muhammad, and then led by a man by the name of Elijah Muhammad. And the chief minister of the Nation of Islam, a proto-Islamic movement, was led by a man by the name of Malcolm X, aka Detroit Red. Born in Omaha, Nebraska, his family was kicked out of Nebraska, had to leave because the Ku Klux Klan burned down their home. Then they resettled in Lansing, Michigan, in which Malcolm X's father was killed by the Ku Klux Klan in Lansing, Michigan. And he lived in Michigan, and he was famously called Detroit Red. He got in criminal trouble, some problems. When he was released from prison, he relocated to Detroit, firstly, and Malcolm X. So Malcolm X began to get nationwide media coverage. And during this time, Mike Wallace, who was on CBS, made the first special news story relating to Muslims called "The Hate That Hate Produced," in which scared the mess out of America regarding Muslims, and you can see this on YouTube. The whole thing is called "The Hate That Hate Produced." I mentioned that the Nation of Islam was a proto-Islamic movement. Malcolm X later moved over to what we could call Orthodox Islam, but they held certain heterodox teachings, being that God came in the person of a man. Mainstream Muslims believe that God is not trapped by space and time. He cannot appear in the form of any created being, man or woman. And the Nation of Islam also taught that all white people are created devils. This was another teaching of the Nation of Islam. And they use as a justification looking at the record of Europeans and what they did to the quote-unquote dark world. And their rationale was, who else but a devil would treat people that way? So this was the logic used by the Nation of Islam. So anyway, this is beginning when Islamophobia reared its head up in the media, and particularly relating to the Nation of Islam. Now, the next time that we see Islamophobia really as a political football and mainstream media relates to the year 1979. And the year 1979 forever changed America. What happened in 1979 was the Iranian Revolution. And the Iranian Revolution was started, or there was the roots of it was that going back to the 60s, there was a free democratic election in Iran by a man by the name of Mohammad Mossadegh, became the president, and he went and nationalized the oil that Iran had, because the British had colonialized Iran, and the British was controlling and pumping out the oil, and it was American and British oil companies that basically were profiting off of Iranian oil to the expense of the Iranian people. When the man became president, he took back the oil, so no, this is our oil. So the CIA then led a coup d'etat and overthrew the democratically elected government of the Iranian people. And they imposed a man by the name of Shah Pahlavi, Shah means king in Persian, who was an American puppet. And due to this, students from the University of Tehran threw him out of power, but also took over the American embassy, because they saw that the seed or the roots of Iranian oppression was our government. So they took over our embassy in 1979, and none of you, or maybe two of you in here are old enough to remember this perhaps. I was very young when this took place. But this is actually how Nightline got started, and Ted Koppel got popular in America, if you know who Ted Koppel is, because every night on the news it would be like day 65, day 100, and then they would show these images of Iran and what was going on there. So in the American psyche, the American mind, over 1 billion Muslims were being understood through the framework of some Iranian students and Khomeini, who overthrew their dictator and took over the American embassy. And to even alienate people who had anti-black racism in regards, when Khomeini took over, when he came back into the country from France, he told university students, one of the first things he said, let go all of the black people in the embassy. And all of the U.S. People who worked in the diplomatic corps were released and allowed to come back to America, except for one CIA agent. And the reason why he said this is that we don't have a problem with black people. Black people's problem is in America, because America is the one who enslaved them and who still discriminates against them, who lynched them, who raped them, etc. He said, we don't have a problem with black people. Black people's problem is America. Black people's problem is not Iran. So, obviously, maybe that didn't sit well with some people with anti-black racist tendencies. Next, then we have the World Trade Center bombing that took place in the early 90s, and then the tragedy of 9/11, in which heightened Islamophobia in America like never before. Now, I'm going to wrap up very shortly, hopefully, but 9/11 was a catastrophe for our country in more than one way. 9/11 was a catastrophe because of the souls that were killed that day. But what it cost our country was even more than those people that were killed that day. And you, in the broader American society, have been victimized by Islamophobia, whether you understand or not. And people in the political discourse have also been targeted by Islamophobia, even though they are not Muslim. And I will give you a very tangible example. So after 9/11, and President George W. Bush went down to the World Trade Center and stood there and proclaimed, we have to go get them. We entered into a couple of military invasions, and there were a series of laws that were passed. One law was the Patriot Act that basically stripped common Americans of certain civil liberties. There was the undermining of the FISA court, a court that was started after President Richard Nixon illegally wiretapped fellow Americans for political reasons. That was undone. There was a special panel. That was undone. And also the formation of the Department of Homeland Security, which is the biggest. George W. Bush, a Republican, they talk like limited government, was as the president has overseen the biggest expansion of government since Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president at the Great Depression, a Republican president, with the forming of the Department of Homeland Security. So what has this meant for regular Americans? It has given carte blanche to the intelligence community to spread and to monitor Americans for their lawful activities. That intelligence services can know what books you check out of the library. They know what websites you go on. If you call family members who are abroad or overseas, they can listen to your phone conversations without warrants. Initial threat assessments can be started on American citizens, and race and national origin can be used as secondary factors to follow American citizens and to listen to their domestic phone calls. And see, when it first started to keep us safe as a country, no one cared because they thought it was just targeting Muslims. But then when we found out with the Edward Snowden leaks that journalists were being spied on, that attorney-client privilege was being broken because they were listening to attorneys who weren't Muslim with their conversations with their clients. When people start going through the airport and being subjected to those x-ray machines that could look through your clothing and see shapes of your private parts, or people then start saying, "Don't touch my junk." Y'all remember hearing that a few years ago? "Don't touch my junk." See, it was cool. You know, everything was copacetic, everything was all right when we thought we were just targeting Muslims. When it started affecting the broader American society, and white Americans in particular, then some people start raising questions about these civil liberty abuses. And the suspected terrorist watch list and the no-fly list, which actually has quadrupled under the Obama administration in comparison to Bush. And under the guise of national security, also mass deportations and breaking up families. President Obama is the deporter-in-chief. He deported more people within less than his first 2 years in office than any president in American history. He deported more people in a year and a half than Bush did in 8 years. And I say this, that I like the policies of President Obama on some things. When it comes to civil liberties, he is worse than George Bush. He is worse than George Bush, and this is what most constitutional law experts and professors will say. When it comes to civil liberties, Barack Hussein Obama, the first African American president, is worse on civil liberties than George Bush, a Republican. So, but the irony of it is, and I made the comment relating to even non-Muslims can be victims of Islamophobia. The example that I'm going to use for you to paint it very clearly is Barack Hussein Obama. When he declared his candidacy in the year 2008, and he's a Christian. He was baptized in the church of Reverend Jeremiah Wright. Jeremiah Wright married him to Michelle Obama. Jeremiah Wright christened his children. Barack Hussein Obama eats pork. He drinks liquor. He's Christian. Because of his heritage on his father's side of the family, he then began to get attacked and run for president regarding about, is he a closet Muslim? He got elected, and then the Tea Party movement swelled, as well as the birther movement. And the type of disrespect that had been pointed towards him, we have not seen take place to American president perhaps since Abraham Lincoln. Unprecedented disrespect. And much of it talking about, he's not really an American, his birth certificate isn't legit, his father was a Kenyan Muslim, or maybe he's a secret Muslim. Michelle Bachmann just said a little over a year ago during the government shutdown, almost 2 years ago, that his government is really infiltrated and ran by the Muslim Brotherhood. Donald Trump, just this past year still questions his citizenship, all this type of stuff. President Obama himself has been a victim of Islamophobia, because Islamophobia in the political discourse is the one accepted form of bigotry in our political discourse. It is an accepted form. And really a lot of this Islamophobia also is code words, right? Because what were they really saying? Because see, these people know that is accepted form of bigotry, right? Muslim in this sense is nothing but a code word for nigger. It's a way of otherizing him. And I'm using that. I don't use that word normally, but I'm using it in this context. They can't flat out call him nigger, but Muslim has the same effect of painting him as something that's un-American and inferior to whiteness in America. Muslim has become de facto nigger. So that's why they use this and able to get away with it. Now let's look at what's just been in the news in the last couple of days with the horrible attack in France. And I'll stop. I'll really stop this time. There's a tragedy that took place in Paris, France. And then our Governor Snyder, responded to calls.
Oh, I was going to say what he did. I thought you were.
Yeah, I'm going to bring it up. Governor Snyder, after a Republican state legislator put out a call saying we should not allow Syrian refugees to be resettled in the state of Michigan, Governor Snyder then put out a statement and said that he's putting a halt on allowing Syrian refugees to come into or be relocated in the state of Michigan. Now, there's implicit Islamophobia in this right here. He said he wanted to stop it because of security concerns and what took place in Paris. First of all those attackers in Paris were homegrown people who already had French citizenship. It has not been proven that any refugee took place in that, number one. Number two, the Department of Homeland Security has a very rigorous background check system to allow anyone to come in here into the United States of America. Moreover, of the people who are going to be placed here in Michigan, and I know the statistics, 400 of them were supposed to have been orphans. Now, what in the world is a kid, an innocent kid, who lost their parents and had to leave Syria because of ISIS, then gets barred to coming to Michigan because of what ISIS did in France? But see, it becomes totally acceptable. Like there's no questioning of it. And then also the centering of white European lives or other people's lives. Dozens of Arabs were killed the day before in Beirut in 2 suicide bombings. No one was putting up pictures of the Lebanese flag or Lebanon's colors or Facebook overlay. Like Zuckerberg didn't do that, right? Less than a month before in Turkey, 109 Muslims in Turkey were killed in a similar attack by ISIS. No one cared about that. If you looked on yesterday, there was a story on CNN. Boko Haram just killed a bunch of Nigerians just the other day. Early this year, 2,000 Nigerians were killed in one attack. In the morning show, the CNN host asked, why was no one talking about this taking place? Or why weren't there calls of governors stopping refugees coming? Because of these attacks over there. You got 2,000 people killed in Nigeria. No one was calling for stopping refugees coming to Michigan or Alabama or Texas. But then, because some people in France got killed, then you're calling for refugees not to be allowed. The host, a white American man, he was very honest about it. He said the reality is that when it comes to our policy, black African lives are less important to us as Americans than white people in France. That's racism. And that's at the roots of Islamophobia. Islamophobia is nothing but a branch on the tree of structural racism. Because when you look at terrorism statistics in America, going back the last 2 decades, 94% of people they actually label as terrorists are people who aren't Muslim, who commit domestic terrorism. It's on the FBI's website. Go to FBI.gov and look it up for yourself. Just within the past less than 2 days, over 70 white supremacists were arrested. Go look it up online. There were plots to go bomb black churches. Dylan Roof, who did that shooting early this year and killed 9 African Americans, the FBI didn't even call him a terrorist. He's not even listed as a terrorist. It would be higher if they actually listed the people who commit terrorism. It would be higher than the 94%, right, of people who aren't Muslim who commit domestic terrorist attacks. But the face of terrorism we're supposedly supposed to be scared of in America or in Michigan are Muslims. You see? This is what white supremacy looks like. White supremacy just isn't the KKK, the Aryan Nation, or neo-Nazis. White supremacy is when the white narrative or white life is centered and the benchmark for what it means to be a human being or humanity is whiteness. That's white supremacy. So white supremacy is thoroughly embedded in American society and politics. That's why we still have Columbus Day as a national holiday. He got lost coming to America, trying to get to India. That's why the people are called Indians. He got lost coming here and then helped institute a system in which 100 million native or indigenous people to America were ethnically cleansed. 96% of their land stolen. And this is a national holiday. It's a white supremacist holiday. Thanksgiving. The indigenous people welcomed the welcome people from Britain, the Pilgrims. Fed them, showed them how to plant corn, take care of themselves, then look at what happened to the tribes later on that welcomed them. They were massacred. That's America. That's the America we don't like talking about. And this is the America that informs Islamophobia. Where we have some systemic double standards of how certain life is centered and valued more and how other people are devalued. That's why it's so easy for Muslims to be devalued in America. And I'm in big trouble because I'm black and Muslim. I can drive while black and fly while Muslims. That's double profiling. With that, I close. Thank you all for listening.
Questions, comments? He's pretty transparent, so.
Yeah, I'm transparent.
That's right. No holding back in here. Sure.
I've never been to a class, and I've been to her class several times, and Professor Rawl. I've never walked out of a class where I wasn't asked at least one question, but maybe this is a first class ever.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
I was kind of curious why, because for the terrorist people have been talking about how Syria shouldn't really have been bombed and how ISIS, they're not actually Muslim, they're not following Muslim, the Quran or the Muslim teachings, and they will say Muslims, like in the Quran it says you're not allowed to kill a tree, you're not allowed to kill an elderly, a woman, a child, someone who surrenders, someone who's retreating. You're only allowed to kill someone in self-defense, or if you were a soldier, killing another soldier during battle. Or the only time if you have take someone prisoner, you have to treat them humanely. I was kind of curious why you never brought that up, because that's a lot of.
Thank you for bringing that up. Firstly, ISIS is as Islamic as the KKK is Christian. That's the best way I can put it. Because as the KKK bombed majority black churches and majority lynch black Christians, ISIS primary victims are other Muslims. Like, how are you going to be Islamic in what you do is bomb mosques, do suicide bombings of mosques? They did one the same day Friday in Baghdad. They went and bombed a funeral procession at a mosque. You know, on Fridays, because like our holy day's Friday, they're going to a mosque and blow themselves up. Like, how are you going to be Islamic and bomb a mosque? Like, that's crazy, right? So, but you made a very good point. Not only is it un-Islamic what ISIS does, but the French response and what they're doing is very troubling. Because their president said that they were going to respond merciless. They're going to have a merciless response, quote unquote merciless. So what they did was they then took the French Air Force and they bombed a city called Raqqa. And Raqqa. They just dropped bombs on a city that's like they're dropping on a majority civilian population. So like they dropped bombs and basically like killed more people like within a few minutes than all that was killed. Civilians that was killed by the parachuting. Now, that's no way of bringing peace. Like bombing civilians in response to a terrorism attack to bring peace is like promoting teen promiscuity as a way of protecting virginity. Like, it don't make any sense. It makes no sense whatsoever. But that's what the French government is doing, right? It's the same thing we did after 9/11, right? Like, Osama bin Laden, first of all, was trained by the CIA. He was a good guy when they were fighting in Russia, because we armed those people, right? And we trained the Taliban. Then he wasn't even in Afghanistan. We really invaded that country because the Taliban, who had visited America months before 9/11, would not allow an oil pipeline through Afghanistan. American oil pipeline, American oil things. Osama bin Laden was in Pakistan. He wasn't even in Afghanistan. We invaded that country. Then we invaded Iraq. They had nothing to do with 9/11. Weapons of mass destruction. Almost 1 million Iraqis were killed because of our invasion to avenge the death of about 2,000 Americans. There are not even 1 million people in the city of Detroit. Just imagine the whole city of Detroit, everybody, including myself, I live in Detroit, being killed. You see? So, if we want to take a look at really who's doing the violence and who is really killing who, if we were really honest about it as a country, then we would see what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said when he gave his speech at the Riverside Church in regards to Vietnam. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world is the American government. And to this day, since 9/11 to this day, our government has more blood on its hands than any other government in the world. Or any terrorist organization, Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Like, what we do makes ISIS look cute. Thank you for bringing that up. And I'm not saying this as being anti-American. I'm saying this because I served in the military. I love America, right? And I have 3 children. I love my children. I don't want my children just doing anything and going wayward. Like, when you love your children, when you love someone, you want to correct their behavior before they send themselves down the path of ruin. That's why Howard Zinn said, the highest form of patriotism, dissent is the highest form of patriotism. Like, if we really love America, we shouldn't just be waving the flag and cheering on this nonsense that our country does. We should be trying to stop America so saving our souls, right? And then, like, as a veteran, I'll get to your question, as a veteran, right, it's like veterans who come back from these wars are mentally messed up from what they see. Our veteran population, veterans are the highest percentage of people in America who are homeless. Like, we don't take care of veterans, and then, like, the military industrial complex, like, we can spend all this money on bombs and planes, but we have schools closing down, Pell Grant funding being cut. Like, there's no reason. We have other countries in the developed world, like Sweden, where people go to their first 2 years of undergrad. I mean, it's free. No one's paying anything there. You're not paying anything. All you're doing is paying for some books. You're not even paying, like you wouldn't even be paying for this class, probably, right? It's like, but we'd rather spend our money on bombs than people, or mass incarceration. Like, we'd rather lock people up in prison. We have almost 3 million people in our corrections, from jails and prisons. We have more people in jail in America than China, and China's almost 4 times larger in population. We talk about, China's a totalitarian regime, right? We have more people. We have about 325 million people in America. China has over 1 billion people. And we have more people in prisons. We have more people in prison in Michigan than certain like regions of China. Isn't that deep? Anyway, go ahead.
My question was about the Syrian immigrants that's been coming here applying for 3 years before the parents act. Are they going to be turned back around?
No, the Syrian immigrants that are here.
No, the ones that's on their way. They've been traveling here for 3 years now. And then the parents attack happened.
The ones who are not in the country, President Obama said at a speech in Turkey a couple of days ago that those people are still going to be allowed to come into the country. Now, this is going to be very interesting, because this is like some old Civil War so-called states' rights type stuff. Is Governor Snyder then going to say that they're not welcome here, they're not able to come here, he's going to defy the federal mandate, the federal law? I mean, like really, like that. That's what we're really looking at. Like, is he going to say no Syrians welcome or no Syrians allowed in Michigan that come, and going to defy the federal law? You see? But see, all of this is partisan politics. If you look at the states where a number of governors said they weren't going to allow Syrian refugees. See, if you look at Georgia, Alabama, Texas, New Jersey, Michigan, they all have one thing in common. They all have Republican governors. If you look at the other states who say they're not going to backtrack and going to let them in, like Oregon, Washington State, they have Democratic governors. So it's the same. See, there's parallels. See, this is called intersectionality, and we have to connect the dots regarding racism, right? Because see, the same people who are talking about we need to build a wall at the southern border to keep Mexicans out, and talking about mass deportation to break up families, the same people. And the same people who blame Black Lives Matter movement for a few cops being shot, were in 2015 shootings of police officers at a 20-year low, whereas shootings of civilians by police is at a 20-year high. These are the same people who are talking this anti-Muslim stuff. It's the same people. It's the same worldview. That's why I say that when I talk about white supremacy, people look at explicit where it can be implicit. And also, a black person or an African American, right, or a person of color, they can't be a white supremacist, but they can have a white racist mentality. This is called internalized oppression, right? So Ben Carson, a lot of stuff that Ben Carson's saying is repeating. Like, I don't know what's wrong with him. No, really. Like I'm just baffled. Like, how can a man be a genius when it comes to surgery and all this stuff just sound so wild? Just wild. I mean, a number of stuff he just says is wild. Yes, ma'am.
So, sorry. When you see, like, when a white person does something, it's, oh, they're a lone wolf, they're mentally ill. But when something else, like when someone of a different religion or race does it, then the whole race or religion gets condemned. How do we stop it? Like, how do we make a change?
Thank you for raising that. And I was just, I put this, I alluded to this on Facebook this morning. I talked about something relating to this. But it's true. When a white person goes and does a mass shooting inside of a theater, then they say, oh, well, they had a rough childhood. You mentally disturbed. Every black and brown person is sane that does shooting, and then every person who's white that does these things is somehow mentally, they had a bad childhood, had a bad day. Let's put a bulletproof vest on him, get him a Burger King, Whopper, and a milkshake, after he killed 9 people in a church. How do we change this is that we need white Americans to be willing to divest from their white privilege and then to speak to other white people and try to move them away from this. See, it's not my job, nor can I do it. I can't do it. It has to be other white people that do it. And it's not really my job, right? And this might sound strange, but see, I'll use the 1964 Civil Rights Act as an example. And actually, Stokely Carmichael, a.k.a. Kwame Ture, used this as an example years ago. When the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, that really wasn't for most black people, right? Because we as black people, we already know that we were supposed to be able to be free to live wherever we want to live. We already knew that we were supposed to be able to attend any school we wanted to attend. That law was for white people to straighten out white folks. That wasn't for black people. That law wasn't for black people. That law was to straighten out white America. Right? So it's white people's responsibility. So like Tim Wise is a very good resource. You can go online and see his TED Talks, and he's written about this. He is he's a critical race theorist who's a white guy who breaks down how white people can divest from white privilege. People of color don't need white people to use their white privilege to uplift black people, because that's patriarchal. That's been traditionally the white liberal model. That doesn't work, right? Affirmative action is a prime example of that, about how that was instituted and championed, because the primary people who've always benefited from affirmative action are white women, not black people. Even when we look at the living wage in America right now, in America, which is far from having gender parity, women on average make 80 cents to every dollar a man makes with equal education. So women do not get paid. I just heard on NPR a story that in boardrooms of corporate America, only 12% of those boardrooms are made up of women. That's deplorable. But guess what? Men of color who are African American, Latino, and Native American with equal education make less per hour than white women. So at the end of the day, racism trumps misogyny in America. Because the white woman with equal education of a black man or of a Latino man still makes more money with equal qualifications. So racism is still the topic, and not to say that sexism is not a problem or sexism is not an issue. It is an issue. But when it comes to America, white women have privilege over black me, black Muslim me. That's just reality. So that's it. Tim Wise is his name. I don't know if you've ever heard of him or not, but you all should look up Tim Wise. He's a great resource. But But again, and I know you have another question, but again, and I say this with all sincerity to white Americans who really want to make a change and make America live up to what she says she is, that she has never been, because we're striving towards this more perfect union that we've never had. It's really white people are the ones who have to put in the work and become a little uncomfortable. And if I can use slavery as an example, there were great black American abolitionists. Harriet Tubman was one of the foremost. Frederick Douglass was a very wonderful spokesman. If you saw the movie 12 Years a Slave, he was a very articulate spokesman. But the reality is, if it wasn't for good white folks, like good white Quakers and good white people in the church that were calling for abolition, see, your black classmates and myself, we might be picking cotton in Alabama right now. Because it's people in the status quo who have to rise up and help implement the change. It just can't be the people who are the marginalized. There has to be some allies from the status quo to help bring about the change, you see? But it shouldn't be a patriarchal type of system. You listen and you hear the needs of the affected group, and then you go amongst your people and champion the concerns and the sensitivities of the marginalized group, not trying to speak upon their behalf, not trying to get in front of them. And that's with anything. It's the same thing with men who try to show allyship with women against misogyny. That's why when there's talks about women in Islam, I don't do those, because Muslim women are more than qualified to talk about Muslim women in Islam. I don't even get there. Someone asked me a question about what about women's rights in Islam. I'm like, ask her. Like, man, that's not for me to speak on. I don't do that.
Sorry, this is a close topic. Do you ever feel like the media kind of like undoes all the work you guys are making to like make people more knowledgeable and like all the good work you're doing to try to fix what's going on? You kind of like just backfire yourself?
The media is part of the problem. It's a big part of the problem. You know, I've been interviewed in TV, radio, and newspaper over 2,000 times. And I've met with editors. And most editorial boards or news editors, there's an unspoken rule. If it bleeds, it leads. Right? The more sensational, the more bloodshed, the more negative, those are stories that lead, not the warm, feel-good stories most of the time. So Muslims who are overwhelmingly law-abiding, contributing to society, that's not mentioned because it's not sexy. It doesn't make good news, right? Or even the ones who are practicing Muslims, their faith never comes up. It's just something that's inconsequential. Like the first round draft pick for the Detroit Lions, the running back, Amir Abdullah, he's Muslim. He's a practicing Muslim. He's Muslim. You know, he ran that 104-yard kickback the other day when Detroit Lions beat the Green Bay Packers for the first time and God knows when in Lambeau, right? That was a Muslim bro who did that, right? But like people don't think about that. That hasn't come up, right? But if a Muslim does something, even if it has nothing negative, even if it has nothing to do with faith, somehow faith gets brought in, right? Whereas if someone who is not Muslim, in particular Christian, does it, then the issue of faith is really never brought up, and that is related to white privilege and Christianity. Socio-politically is considered a white religion in America, even though Jesus was born in Palestine and spoke Aramaic. Like he didn't even speak Greek, right? But somehow the West in Europe has owned Christianity. He wasn't white. So the media is definitely part of the problem, and it's very hard to deal with, because even if Muslims get into newsrooms to help mainstream Muslims, it's a corporate culture that's so deep. See, capitalism is something else, right? Fox News is the most watched news station in America, right? And they have found a way of profiting off of the most sensationalized coverage. It doesn't even qualify as news, actually. It's not news, because it's so politically biased, their coverage, right? But they're making money. If they suffered some consequences, if people began to boycott those companies that advertise with Fox News, and they faced a serious threat to their bottom line, the reality is their news coverage would change. But because so many Americans like that stuff or are apathetic, Fox just keeps on doing what's doing. And CNN these days is really not even that much better than Fox, especially my man Don Lemon. He's a mess too. Don Lemon is a mess. Yes, ma'am.
I was just gonna say, like, the reason I don't know, like, I don't know if y'all heard, but I'm married into a Muslim family. I'm the first white person allowed into this family. And when people find out I'm married to a Muslim family, things they've heard on the media, they go to all Muslims. Like, my parents straight up told me they watched there's this Lifetime movie where the girl went overseas, and the child got kidnapped, hostage, and she wasn't allowed out of the house. My parents straight up told me they do not want me going overseas to this family. If this family want to see me, come over. And when I said I plan on going overseas, they said if you have kids there, then they can stay with me, and you guys can go overseas then. If that's how you really feel, your kids don't need to go overseas with you. And I was like, and even people at my work, when they found out, they straight up told me, I don't think you should marry them. I think you should say no and get back the ring. And I was like, you know nothing about the person I'm marrying. You know nothing, but you're doing it because of things you've heard. You heard, oh, if you go overseas, you're going to have no rights. I get that. Oh, they're dominating. You're going to get abused. You're going to, he's going to become abusive all of a sudden.
And you went, right?
Well, I'm still going to be married. Like I said, I'm going to be married in October.
Oh, get married in October, okay.
But it's just all these things that people you would think would have the decency, okay, you don't mention it, just oh, congratulations, or just don't say anything. And people I barely know, I had only started working at a few months before, are you should tell them no. Just telling me how horrible the person I'm marrying is when they had never even met him and they knew nothing about him. And most of the stuff they were saying, it's because of the stuff they heard on the media or movies they heard. It wasn't because they actually knew anything about their culture. And they try acting like they know, oh, they believe in Allah. I'm like, do you know Allah is the word for God? They believe in God too. Jesus is in the Quran. The Quran is the word for the Bible. It's actually very similar with just some differences.
And by the way, the most used word in the Arabic version of the Bible is Allah. Christian Arabs use that word. It's not a Muslim-specific word. So I'm glad that you did mention that, and I'm sorry that you're going through that. That's racism. That's just it. And I've heard some stories like this before. It's nothing that is unique. I will say, and I mentioned it goes back to racism. Because of historical factors, and there's even polling relating to this, that anti-Muslim sentiments in America are least amongst African Americans. And there's reasons for this. One is that historically, I mean, it goes beyond lineage and roots. Like Kunta Kinte was Muslim, right? But the era of the civil rights movement and some of the most popular cultural figures in Black America are Muslims. Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali, right, are two like prime examples. Many African Americans in urban areas will have at least one family member or friend who's Muslim in most urban areas: Detroit, Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, most. When I grew up in the 80s and early 90s, many of the popular rappers would rap and they would have Islamic motifs in their rap songs when rap used to be socially conscious before this Young Thug BS, like Public Enemy and rap groups like that, like they're Muslim. Chuck D, Big Daddy Kane, I don't know if some of you all know who these names are, Poor Righteous Teachers. Like it was like thorough, like in our culture. Even the push amongst many black Americans to give up eating pork or to take on Afrocentric names, Arabic names, Swahili names, is influence from Muslims in the 60s and the 70s. I mean, it's nothing to have a black person who's not Muslim be named Aisha, Jamila, or Jamal. Like these are Muslim names, right? So there's a different type of socialization between black people and Muslims than white Americans and Muslims. Okay, well, I guess that's it. Thank you.